This is section 84 of Mark Twain, a biography. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 84, Roughing It. Telegram to Redpath. How in the name of God does a man find his way from here to Amherst, and when must he start? Give me full particulars, and send a man with me. If I had another engagement I would rot before I would fill it. S. L. Clemens. This was at the end of February, and he believed that he was standing on the platform for the last time. He loathed the drudgery of the work, and he considered there was no further need. He was no longer in debt, and his income, he accounted, ample. His new book, Roughing It (it was Bliss who had given the new book the title of Roughing It; Innocence at Home had been its provisional title, certainly a misleading one, though it has been retained in England for the second volume, for what reason it would be difficult to explain), had had a large advance sale, and its earnings promised to rival those of the Innocents. He resolved in the future to confine himself to the trade and profits of authorship. The new book had advantages in its favor. Issued early in the year, it was offered at the best canvassing season, particularly so as the author's lectures had prepared the public for its reception. Furthermore, it dealt with the most picturesque phases of American life, scenes and episodes vastly interesting at that time, and peculiarly adapted to Mark Twain's literary expression. In a different way, Roughing It is quite as remarkable as The Innocents Abroad. If it has less charm, it has greater interest, and it is by no means without charm. There is something delicious, for instance, in this bit of pure enjoyment of the first day's overland travel. It was now just dawn, and as we stretched our cramped legs full length on the mail sacks and gazed out through the windows across the wide wastes of greensward clad in cool, powdery mist, to where there was an expectant look in the eastern horizon, our perfect enjoyment took the form of a tranquil and contented ecstasy. The stage whirled along at a spanking gait, the breeze flapping the curtains and suspended coats in a most exhilarating way. The cradle swayed and swung luxuriously, the pattering of the horses' hoofs, the cracking of the driver's whip, and his "Hee g'lang!" were music. The spinning ground and the waltzing trees appeared to give us a mute hurrah as we went by, and then slack up and look after us with interest and envy or something. And as we lay and smoked the pipe of peace, and compared all this luxury with the years of tiresome city life that had gone before it, we felt that there was only one complete and satisfying happiness in the world, and we had found it. Also there is that lofty presentation of South Pass, and a picture of the alkali desert, so parching, so withering in its choking realism, that it makes the throat ache and the tongue dry to read it. Just a bit of the desert in passing. The sun beats down with a dead, blistering, relentless malignity. The perspiration is welling from every pore in man and beast, but scarcely a sign of it finds its way to the surface. It is absorbed before it gets there. There is not the faintest breath of air stirring, there is not a merciful shred of cloud in all the brilliant firmament. There is not a living creature visible in any direction whither one searches the blank level that stretches its monotonous miles on every hand. There is not a sound, not a sigh, not a whisper, not a buzz, or a whir of wings, or distant pipe of bird, not even a sob from the lost souls that doubtless people that dead air. As for the humor of the book, it has been chiefly famous for that. Buck Fanshaw's funeral has become a classic, and the purchase of the Mexican Plug. But it is to no purpose to review the book here in detail. We have already reviewed the life and environment out of which it grew. Without doubt the story would have contained more of the poetic and contemplative, in which he was always at his best, if the subject itself, as in The Innocents, had lent itself oftener to this form of writing. It was the lack of that halo, perhaps, which caused the new book never quite to rank with its great forerunner in public favor. There could hardly be any other reason. It presented a fresher theme, it abounded in humor, technically it was better written. Seemingly it had all the elements of popularity and of permanence. It did, in fact, possess these qualities, but its sales, except during the earlier months of its canvass, never quite equaled those of The Innocents Abroad. Roughing It was accepted by the public for just what it was, and is, a great picture of the overland pioneer days, a marvelous picture of frontier aspects at a time when the frontier itself, even with its hardships and its tragedies, was little more than a vast primal joke, when all frontiersmen were obliged to be laughing philosophers in order to survive the stress of its warfares. A word here about this Western humor. It is a distinct product. It grew out of a distinct condition the battle with the frontier. The fight was so desperate, to take it seriously was to surrender. Women laughed that they might not weep, men when they could no longer swear. Western humor was the result. It is the freshest, wildest humor in the world, but there is tragedy behind it. Roughing It presented the picture of those early conditions with the startling vividness and truth of a great novel, which, in effect, it was. It was not accurate history even of the author's own adventures. It was true in its aspects rather than in its details. The greater artist disregards the truth of detail to render more strikingly a phase or a condition, to produce an atmosphere, to reconstruct a vanished time. This was what Mark Twain did in Roughing It. He told the story of overland travel and the frontier for his own and future generations, in what is essentially a picaresque novel, a work of unperishing fiction, founded on fact. The sales of Roughing It during the first 3 months aggregated nearly 40,000 copies, and the author was lavishly elate accordingly. To Orion, who had already closed his career with Bliss by exercise of those hereditary eccentricities through which he so often came to grief, he gave $1,000 out of the first royalty check, in acknowledgment of the memorandum book and other data which Orion had supplied. Clemens believed the new book would sell 100,000 copies within the year, but the sale diminished presently, and at the end of the first year it was considerably behind The Innocents for the same period. As already stated, it required 10 years for Roughing It to reach the 100,000 mark, which The Innocents reached in 3. End of Chapter 84. Roughing It. Read by John Greenman. This is section 85 of Mark Twain, a biography. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, A Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 85, A Birth, a Death, and a Voyage. The year 1872 was an eventful one in Mark Twain's life. At Elmira, on March 19th, his second child, a little girl, whom they named Susan Olivia, was born. On June 2nd, in the new home in Hartford, to which they had recently moved, his first child, a little boy, Langdon, died. He had never been strong, his wavering life had often been uncertain, all was more of the spirit than the body, and in Elmira he contracted a heavy cold, or perhaps it was diphtheria from the beginning. In later years, whenever Clemens spoke of the little fellow, he never failed to accuse himself of having been the cause of the child's death. It was Mrs. Clemens's custom to drive out each morning with Langdon, and once, when she was unable to go, Clemens himself went instead. "I should not have been permitted to do it," he said, remembering. "I was not qualified for any such responsibility as that. Some one should have gone who had at least the rudiments of a mind. Necessarily I would lose myself dreaming. After a while the coachman looked around and noticed that the carriage robes had dropped away from the little fellow, and that he was exposed to the chilly air. He called my attention to it, but it was too late. Tonsillitis or something of the sort set in, and he did not get any better, so we took him to Hartford. There it was pronounced diphtheria, and of course he died." So, with or without reason, he added the blame of another tragedy to the heavy burden of remorse which he would go on piling up while he lived. The blow was a terrible one to Mrs. Clemens. Even the comfort of the little new baby on her arm could not ease the ache in her breast. It seemed to her that death was pursuing her. In one of her letters she says: "I feel so often as if my path is to be lined with graves," and she expresses the wish that she may drop out of life herself before her sister and her husband, a wish which the years would grant. They did not return to Elmira, for it was thought that the air of the shore would be better for the little girl, so they spent the summer at Saybrook, Connecticut, at Fenwick Hall, leaving Orion and his wife in charge of the house at Hartford. Beyond a few sketches, Clemens did very little literary work that summer, but he planned a trip to Europe, and he invented what is still known and sold as the Mark Twain Scrap Book. He wrote to Orion of his proposed trip to England, and dilated upon his scrap book with considerable enthusiasm. The idea had grown out of the inconvenience of finding a paste jar and the general mussiness of scrap book keeping. His new plan was a self-pasting scrap book, with the gum laid on in narrow strips, requiring only to be damped with a sponge, or other moist substance, to be ready for the clipping. He states that he intended to put the invention into the hands of Sloat, Woodman & Co., of whom Dan Sloat, his old Quaker City roommate, was the senior partner, and have it manufactured for the trade. About this time began Mark Twain's long and active interest in copyright. Previously he had not much considered the subject. He had taken it for granted there was no step that he could take while international piracy was a recognized institution. On both sides of the water books were appropriated, often without profit, sometimes even without credit to the author. To tell the truth, Clemens had at first regarded it rather in the nature of a compliment that his books should be thought worth pirating in England, but as time passed he realized that he was paying heavily for this recognition. Furthermore, he decided that he was forfeiting a right, rather than he was being deprived of it, something which it was in his nature to resent. When Roughing It had been ready for issue, he agreed with Bliss that they should try the experiment of copyrighting it in England, and see how far the law would protect them against the voracious little publisher, who thus far had not only snapped up everything bearing Mark Twain's signature, but had included in a volume of Mark Twain's sketches certain examples of very weak humor with which Mark Twain had been previously unfamiliar. Whatever the English pirate's opinion of the copyright protection of Roughing It may have been, he did not attempt to violate it. This was gratifying. Clemens came to regard England as a friendly power. He decided to visit it and spy out the land. He would make the acquaintance of its people and institutions and write a book which would do these things justice. He gave out no word of his real purpose. He merely said that he was going over to see his English publishers, and perhaps to arrange for a few lectures. He provided himself with some stylographic notebooks by which he could produce 2 copies of his daily memoranda, one for himself and one to mail to Mrs. Clemens, and sailed on the Scotia August 21, 1872. Arriving in Liverpool, he took train for London, and presently the wonderful charm of that old, finished country broke upon him. His first hour in England was an hour of delight, he records, of rapture and ecstasy. These are the best words I can find, but they are not adequate. They are not strong enough to convey the feeling which this first vision of rural England brought me. Then he noticed that the gentleman opposite in his compartment paid no attention to the scenery, but was absorbed in a green-covered volume. He was so absorbed in it that by and by Clemens's curiosity was aroused. He shifted his position a little, and his eye caught the title. It was the first volume of the English edition of The Innocents Abroad. This was gratifying for a moment. Then he remembered that the man had never laughed, never even smiled during the hour of his steady reading. Clemens recalled what he had heard of the English lack of humor. He wondered if this was a fair example of it, and if the man could be really taking seriously every word he was reading. Clemens could not look at the scenery any more for watching his fellow passenger, waiting with a fascinated interest for the paragraph that would break up that iron-clad solemnity. It did not come. During all the rest of the trip to London the atmosphere of the compartment remained heavy with gloom. He drove to the Langham Hotel, always popular with Americans, established himself, and went to look up his publishers. He found the Routledges about to sit down to luncheon in a private room upstairs in their publishing house. He joined them, and not a soul stirred from that table again until evening. The Routledges had never heard Mark Twain talk before, never heard any one talk who in the least resembled him. Various refreshments were served during the afternoon, came and went, while this marvelous creature talked on and they listened, reveling and wondering if America had any more of that sort at home. By and by dinner was served. Then, after a long time, when there was no further excuse for keeping him there, they took him to the Savage Club, where there were yet other refreshments, and a gathering of the clans to welcome this new arrival as a being from some remote and unfamiliar star. Tom Hood, the younger, was there, and Harry Lee, and Stanley the explorer, who had but just returned from finding Livingstone, and Henry Irving, and many another whose name remains, though the owners of those names are all dead now, and their laughter and their good fellowship are only a part of that intangible fabric which we call the past. Clemens had first known Stanley as a newspaper man. "I first met him when he reported a lecture of mine in St. Louis," he said once in a conversation where the name of Stanley was mentioned. Chapter 85. A Birth, a Death, and a Voyage. Read by John Greenman. This is section 86 of Mark Twain, a biography. Recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, A Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 86, England. From that night Mark Twain's stay in England could not properly be called a gloomy one. Routledge, Hood, Lee, and in fact all literary London set themselves the task of giving him a good time. Whatever place of interest they could think of he was taken there. Whatever there was to see he saw it. Dinners, receptions, and assemblies were not complete without him. The White Friars Club and others gave banquets in his honor. He was the sensation of the day. When he rose to speak on these occasions he was greeted with wild cheers. Whatever he said they eagerly applauded. Too eagerly sometimes, in the fear that they might be regarded as insensible to American humor. Other speakers delighted in chaffing him in order to provoke his retorts. When a speaker humorously referred to his American habit of carrying a cotton umbrella, his reply that he followed this custom because a cotton umbrella was the only kind of an umbrella that an Englishman wouldn't steal, was all over England next day, and regarded as one of the finest examples of wit since the days of Swift. The suddenness and completeness of his acceptance by the great ones of London rather overwhelmed and frightened him, made him timid. Joaquin Miller writes: "He was shy as a girl, although time was already coyly flirting white flowers at his temples, and could hardly be coaxed to meet the learned and great who wanted to take him by the hand." Many came to call on him at his hotel, among them Charles Reade and Canon Kingsley. Kingsley came twice without finding him, then wrote, asking for an appointment. Reade invited his assistance on a novel. Indeed, it was in England that Mark Twain was first made to feel that he had come into his rightful heritage. Whatever may have been the doubts concerning him in America, there was no question in England. Howells says: "In England rank, fashion, and culture rejoiced in him. Lord Mayors, Lord Chief Justices, and magnates of many kinds were his hosts. He was desired in country houses, and his bold genius captivated the favor of periodicals which spurned the rest of our nation." After that first visit of Mark Twain's, when Americans in England, referring to their great statesmen, authors, and the like, naturally mentioned the names of Seward, Webster, Lowell, or Holmes, the English comment was likely to be, "Never mind those. We can turn out academic Sewards by the dozen, and cultured humorists like Lowell and Holmes by the score. Tell us of Lincoln, Artemus Ward, and Mark Twain. We cannot match these. They interest us." And it was true. History could not match them, for they were unique. Clemens would have been more than human if in time he had not realized the fuller meaning of this triumph and exulted in it a little to the folks at home. There never lived a more modest, less pretentious, less aggressive man than Mark Twain, but there never lived a man who took a more childlike delight in genuine appreciation; and, being childlike, it was only human that he should wish those nearest to him to share his happiness. After one memorable affair he wrote: "I have been received in a sort of tremendous way to night by the brains of London, assembled at the annual dinner of the Sheriffs of London, mine being, between you and me, a name which was received with a thundering outburst of spontaneous applause when the long list of guests was called. I might have perished on the spot but for the friendly support and assistance of my excellent friend, Sir John Bennett." This letter does not tell all of the incident or the real reason why he might have perished on the spot. During the long roll call of guests he had lost interest a little, and was conversing in whispers with his excellent friend, Sir John Bennett, stopping to applaud now and then when the applause of the others indicated that some distinguished name had been pronounced. All at once the applause broke out with great vehemence. This must be some very distinguished person indeed. He joined in it with great enthusiasm. When it was over he whispered to Sir John, "Whose name was that we were just applauding?" "Mark Twain's," whereupon the support was needed. Poor little pirate Hotten did not have a happy time during this visit. He had reveled in the prospect at first, for he anticipated a large increase to be derived from his purloined property. But suddenly, one morning, he was aghast to find in the Spectator a signed letter from Mark Twain, in which he was repudiated, referred to as John Camden Hottentot, an unsavory person generally. Hotten also sent a letter to the Spectator in which he attempted to justify himself, but it was a feeble performance. Clemens prepared two other communications, each worse than the other, and both more destructive than the first. But these were only to relieve his mind. He did not print them. In one of them he pursued the fancy of John Camden Hottentot, whom he offers as a specimen to the Zoological Gardens. "It is not a bird, it is not a man, it is not a fish. It does not seem to be in all respects a reptile. It has the body and features of a man, but scarcely any of the instincts that belong to such a structure. I am sure that this singular little creature is the missing link between the man and the hyena." Hotten had preyed upon explorer Stanley and libeled him in a so-called biography to a degree that had really aroused some feeling against Stanley in England. Only for the moment the Queen invited Stanley to luncheon, and newspaper criticism ceased. Hotten was in general disrepute, therefore, so it was not worth while throwing a second brick at him. In fact, now that Clemens had expended his venom on paper, Hotten seemed to him rather an amusing figure than otherwise. An incident grew out of it all, however, that was not amusing. E. P. Hingston, whom the reader may remember as having been with Artemus Ward in Virginia City, and one of that happy group that wined and dined the year away, had been engaged by Hotten to write the introductory to his edition of the Innocents Abroad. It was a well-written, highly complimentary appreciation. Hingston did not dream that he was committing an offense, nor did Clemens himself regard it as such in the beginning. But Mark Twain's views had undergone a radical change, and with characteristic dismissal of previous conditions he had forgotten that he had ever had any other views than those he now held. Hingston was in London, and one evening, at a gathering, approached Clemens with outstretched hand. But Clemens failed to see Hingston's hand or to recognize him. In after years his conscience hurt him terribly for this. He remembered it only with remorse and shame. Once, in his old age, he spoke of it with deep sorrow. End of Chapter 86. England. Read by John Greenman. This is section 87 of Mark Twain, a Biography. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography. Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 87. The Book That Was Never Written. The book on England, which he had prepared for so carefully, was never written. Hundreds of the stylographic pages were filled, and the duplicates sent home for the entertainment of Olivia Clemens, but the notes were not completed, and the actual writing was never begun. There was too much sociability in London, for one thing, and then he found that he could not write entertainingly of England without introducing too many personalities, and running the risk of offending those who had taken him into their hearts and homes. In a word, he would have to write too seriously, or not at all. He began his memoranda industriously enough, and the volume might have been as charming and as valuable as any he has left behind. The reader will hardly fail to find a few of the entries interesting. They are offered here as examples of his daily observation during those early weeks of his stay, and to show somewhat of his purpose. An expatriate. There was once an American thief who fled his country and took refuge in England. He dressed himself after the fashion of the Londoners, and taught his tongue the peculiarities of the London pronunciation, and did his best in all ways to pass himself for a native. But he did two fatal things. He stopped at the Langham Hotel, and the first trip he took was to visit Stratford-on-Avon and the grave of Shakespeare. These things betrayed his nationality. Stanley and the Queen. See the power a monarch wields. When I arrived here 2 weeks ago, the papers and geographers were in a fair way to eat poor Stanley up without salt or sauce. The Queen says, "Come 400 miles up into Scotland and sit at my luncheon table 15 minutes," which, being translated, means, "Gentlemen, I believe in this man and take him under my protection," and not another yelp is heard. At the British Museum. What a place it is! Mention some very rare curiosity of a peculiar nature, a something which you have read about somewhere, but never seen. They show you a dozen. They show you all the possible varieties of that thing. They show you curiously wrought jeweled necklaces of beaten gold, worn by the ancient Egyptians, Assyrians, Etruscans, Greeks, Britons, every people of the forgotten ages indeed. They show you the ornaments of all the tribes and peoples that live or ever did live. Then they show you a cast taken from Cromwell's face in death. Then the venerable vase that once contained the ashes of Xerxes. I am wonderfully thankful for the British Museum. Nobody comes bothering around me, nobody elbows me. All the room and all the light I want under this huge dome, no disturbing noises, and people standing ready to bring me a copy of pretty much any book that ever was printed under the sun. And if I choose to go wandering about the long corridors and galleries of the great building, the secrets of all the earth and all the ages are laid open to me. I am not capable of expressing my gratitude for the British Museum. It seems as if I do not know any but little words and weak ones. Westminster Abbey by night. It was past 11 o'clock, and I was just going to bed, but this friend of mine was as reliable as he was eccentric, and so there was not a doubt in my mind that his expedition had merit in it. I put on my coat and boots again, and we drove away. "Where is it? Where are we going?" "Don't worry. You'll see." He was not inclined to talk, so I thought this must be a weighty matter. My curiosity grew with the minutes, but I kept it manfully under the surface. I watched the lamps, the signs, the numbers as we thundered down the long street. I am always lost in London, day or night. It was very chilly, almost bleak. People leaned against the gusty blasts, as if it were the dead of winter. The crowds grew thinner and thinner, and the noises waxed faint and seemed far away. The sky was overcast and threatening. We drove on and still on, till I wondered if we were ever going to stop. At last we passed by a spacious bridge and a vast building, and presently entered a gateway, passed through a sort of tunnel, and stopped in a court surrounded by the black outlines of a great edifice. Then we alighted, walked a dozen steps or so, and waited. In a little while footsteps were heard. A man emerged from the darkness, and we dropped into his wake without saying anything. He led us under an archway of masonry, and from that into a roomy tunnel, through a tall iron gate which he locked behind us. We followed him down this tunnel, guided more by his footsteps on the stone flagging than by anything we could very distinctly see. At the end of it we came to another iron gate, and our conductor stopped there and lit a bull's-eye lantern. Then he unlocked the gate, and I wished he had oiled it first, it grated so dismally. The gate swung open, and we stood on the threshold of what seemed a limitless domed and pillared cavern, carved out of the solid darkness. The conductor and my friend took off their hats reverently, and I did likewise. For the moment that we stood thus there was not a sound, and the stillness seemed to add to the solemnity of the gloom. I looked my inquiry. "It is the tomb of the great dead of England, Westminster Abbey." We were among the tombs. On every hand dull shapes of men, sitting, standing, or stooping, inspected us curiously out of the darkness, reached out their hands toward us, some appealing, some beckoning, some warning us away. Effigies they were, statues over the graves, but they looked human and natural in the murky shadows. Now a little half-grown black and white cat squeezed herself through the bars of the iron gate and came purring lovingly about us, unawed by the time or the place, unimpressed by the marble pomp that sepulchers a line of mighty dead that ends with a great author of yesterday and began with a sceptered monarch away back in the dawn of history, more than 1,200 years ago. Mr. Wright flashed his lantern first upon this object and then upon that, and kept up a running commentary that showed there was nothing about the venerable Abbey that was trivial in his eyes or void of interest. He is a man in authority, being superintendent, and his daily business keeps him familiar with every nook and corner of the great pile, casting a luminous ray now here, now yonder. He would say, "Observe the height of the Abbey, 103 feet to the base of the roof. I measured it myself the other day. Notice the base of this column, old, very old, hundreds and hundreds of years, and how well they knew how to build in those old days. Notice it, every stone is laid horizontally, that is to say, just as nature laid it originally in the quarry, not set up edgewise. In our day some people set them on edge, and then wonder why they split and flake. Architects cannot teach nature anything. Let me remove this matting. It is put here to preserve the pavement. Now there is a bit of pavement that is 700 years old. You can see by these scattering clusters of colored mosaics how beautiful it was before time and sacrilegious idlers marred it. Now there, in the border, was an inscription once. See? Follow the circle. You can trace it by the ornaments that have been pulled out. Here is an A, and there is an O, and yonder another A, all beautiful old English capitals. There is no telling what the inscription was, no record left now. Now move along in this direction, if you please. Yonder is where old King Sebert the Saxon lies. His monument is the oldest one in the Abbey. Sebert died in 616. Clemens probably misunderstood the name. It was Ethelbert who died in 616. The name Sebert does not appear in any Saxon annals accessible to the author. And that's as much as 1,250 years ago. Think of it! 1,250 years. Now yonder is the last one, Charles Dickens, there on the floor, with the brass letters on the slab, and to this day the people come and put flowers on it. There is Garrick's monument, and Addison's, and Thackeray's bust, and Macaulay lies there, and close to Dickens and Garrick lie Sheridan and Dr. Johnson, and here is old Parr. That stone there covers Campbell, the poet. Here are names you know pretty well, Milton and Gray, who wrote the Elegy, and Butler, who wrote Hudibras, and Edmund Spenser and Ben Jonson. There are 3 tablets to him scattered about the Abbey, and all got "O rare Ben Jonson" cut on them. You were standing on one of them just now. He is buried standing up. There used to be a tradition here that explains it. The story goes that he did not dare ask to be buried in the Abbey, so he asked King James if he would make him a present of 18 inches of English ground, and the king said yes, and asked him where he would have it, and he said, "In Westminster Abbey." Well, the king wouldn't go back on his word, and so there he is, sure enough, stood up on end. The reader may regret that there are not more of these entries, and that the book itself was never written. Just when he gave up the project is not recorded. He was urged to lecture in London, but declined. To Mrs. Clemens in September he wrote: "Everybody says lecture, 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 but I have not the least idea of doing it, certainly not at present. Mr. Dolby, who took Dickens to America, is coming to talk business tomorrow, though I have sent him word once before that I can't be hired to talk here, because I have no time to spare. There is too much sociability. I do not get along fast enough with work." In October he declared that he was very homesick, and proposed that Mrs. Clemens and Susy join him at once in London, unless she would prefer to have him come home for the winter and all of them return to London in the spring. So it is likely that the book was not then abandoned. He felt that his visit was by no means ended, that it was, in fact, only just begun, but he wanted the ones he loved most to share it with him. To his mother and sister in November he wrote: "I came here to take notes for a book, but I haven't done much but attend dinners and make speeches. I have had a jolly good time, and I do hate to go away from these English folks. They make a stranger feel entirely at home, and they laugh so easily that it is a comfort to make after dinner speeches here. I have made hundreds of friends, and last night in the crush at the opening of the new Guildhall Library and Museum I was surprised to meet a familiar face every other step." All his impressions of England had been happy ones. He could deliver a gentle satire now and then at certain British institutions, certain London localities and features, as in his speech at the Savage Club, September 28, 1872. This is probably the most characteristic speech made by Mark Twain during his first London visit. The reader will find it in full in Appendix L, at the end of last volume. But taking the snug island as a whole, its people, its institutions, its fair rural aspects, he had found in it only delight. To Mrs. Crane he wrote: "If you and Theodore will come over in the spring with Livy and me, and spend the summer, you shall see a country that is so beautiful that you will be obliged to believe in fairyland. There is nothing like it elsewhere on the globe. You should have a season ticket and travel up and down every day between London and Oxford and worship nature. And Theodore can browse with me among dusty old dens that look now as they looked 500 years ago, and puzzle over books in the British Museum that were made before Christ was born, and in the customs of their public dinners, and the ceremonies of every official act, and the dresses of 1,000 dignitaries, trace the speech and manners of all the centuries that have dragged their lagging decades over England since the Heptarchy fell asunder. I would a good deal rather live here if I could get the rest of you over." He sailed November 12th on the Batavia, loaded with Christmas presents for everybody, jewelry, furs, laces, also a practical steam engine for his namesake, Sam Moffett. Halfway across the Atlantic the Batavia ran into a hurricane and was badly damaged by heavy seas, and was driven far out of her course. It was a lucky event on the whole, for she fell in with a waterlogged lumber bark, a complete wreck, with 9 surviving sailors clinging to her rigging. In the midst of the wild gale a lifeboat was launched and the perishing men were rescued. Clemens prepared a graphic report of the matter for the Royal Humane Society, asking that medals be conferred upon the brave rescuers, a document that was signed by his fellow passengers and obtained for the men complete recognition and wide celebrity. Closing, the writer said: "As might have been anticipated, if I have been of any service toward rescuing these 9 shipwrecked human beings by standing around the deck in a furious storm, without an umbrella, keeping an eye on things and seeing that they were done right, and yelling whenever a cheer seemed to be the important thing, I am glad and I am satisfied. I ask no reward. I would do it again under the same circumstances. But what I do plead for, earnestly and sincerely, is that the Royal Humane Society will remember our captain and our lifeboat crew, and in so remembering them increase the high honor and esteem in which the society is held all over the civilized world." The Batavia reached New York November 26, 1872. Mark Twain had been absent 3 months, during which he had been brought to at least a partial realization of what his work meant to him and to mankind. An election had taken place during his absence, an election which gratified him deeply, for it had resulted in the second presidency of General Grant and in the defeat of Horace Greeley, whom he admired perhaps, but not as presidential material. To Thomas Nast, who had aided very effectually in Mr. Greeley's overwhelming defeat, Clemens wrote: "Nast, you more than any other man have won a prodigious victory for Grant. I mean rather for civilization and progress. Those pictures were simply marvelous, and if any man in the land has a right to hold his head up and be honestly proud of his share in this year's vast events, that man is unquestionably yourself. We all do sincerely honor you and are proud of you." Horace Greeley's peculiar abilities and eccentricities won celebrity for him rather than voters. Mark Twain once said of him: "He was a great man, an honest man, and served his country well and was an honor to it. Also he was a good-natured man, but abrupt with strangers if they annoyed him when he was busy. He was profane, but that is nothing. The best of us is that. I did not know him well, but only just casually, and by accident. I never met him but once. I called on him in the Tribune office, but I was not intending to. I was looking for Whitelaw Reid, and got into the wrong den. He was alone at his desk, writing, and we conversed, not long, but just a little. I asked him if he was well, and he said, 'What the hell do you want?' Well, I couldn't remember what I wanted, so I said I would call again, but I didn't." Clemens did not always tell the incident just in this way. Sometimes it was John Hay he was looking for instead of Reid, and the conversation with Greeley varied, but perhaps there was a germ of history under it somewhere, and, at any rate, it could have happened well enough, and not have been out of character with either of the men. End of Chapter 87. The Book That Was Never Written. Read by John Greenman. This is section 88 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 88, The Gilded Age. Mark Twain did not go on the lecture circuit that winter. Redpath had besought him as usual, and even in midsummer had written, "Will you? Won't you? We have $7,000 to $8,000 in engagements recorded for you," and he named a list of towns ranging geographically from Boston to St. Paul. But Clemens had no intention then of ever lecturing any more, and again in November, from London, he announced to Redpath, "When I yell again for less than $500 I'll be pretty hungry. But I haven't any intention of yelling at any price." Redpath pursued him, and in January proposed $400 for a single night in Philadelphia, but without result. He did lecture 2 nights in Steinway Hall for the Mercantile Library Association on the basis of half profits, netting $1,300 for the 2 nights as his share, and he lectured 1 night in Hartford at a profit of $1,500 for charity. Father Hawley, of Hartford, had announced that his missionary work was suffering for lack of funds. Some of his people were actually without food, he said, their children crying with hunger. No one ever responded to an appeal like that quicker than Samuel Clemens. He offered to deliver a lecture free, and to bear an equal proportion of whatever expenses were incurred by the committee of 8 who agreed to join in forwarding the project. He gave the Sandwich Island lecture, and at the close of it a large card was handed him with the figures of the receipts printed upon it. It was held up to view, and the house broke into a storm of cheers. He did very little writing during the early weeks following his return. Early in the year, January 3 and 6, 1873, he contributed 2 Sandwich Island letters to the Tribune, in which, in his own peculiar fashion, he urged annexation. "We must annex those people," he declared, and proceeded to specify the blessings we could give them, such as leather-headed juries, the insanity law, the Tweed ring. "We can confer Woodhull and Claffin on them, and George Francis Train. We can give them lecturers. I will go myself. We can make that little bunch of sleepy islands the hottest corner on earth, and array it in the moral splendor of our high and holy civilization. Annexation is what the poor islanders need. Shall we, to men benighted, the lamp of life deny?" His success in England became an incentive to certain American institutions to recognize his gifts at home. Early in the year he was dined as the guest of the Lotos Club of New York, and a week or 2 later elected to its membership. This was but a beginning. Some new membership or honor was offered every little while, and so many banquets that he finally invented a set form for declining them. He was not yet recognized as the foremost American man of letters, but undoubtedly he had become the most popular, and Edwin Whipple, writing at this time, or but a little later, said, "Mark Twain is regarded chiefly as a humorist, but the exercise of his real talents would rank him with the ablest of our authors in the past 50 years." So he was beginning to be discovered in high places. It was during this winter that the Clemens household enjoyed its first real home life in Hartford, its first real home life anywhere since those earliest days of marriage. The Hooker mansion was a comfortable place. The little family had comparatively good health. Their old friends were stanch and lavishly warm-hearted, and they had added many new ones. Their fireside was a delightful nucleus around which gathered those they cared for most, the Twichells, the Warner families, the Trumbulls, all certain of a welcome there. George Warner, only a little while ago, remembering, said, "The Clemens house was the only one I have ever known where there was never any preoccupation in the evenings, and where visitors were always welcome. Clemens was the best kind of a host. His evenings after dinner were an unending flow of stories. Friends living near by usually came and went at will, often without the ceremony of knocking or formal leave taking. They were more like one great family in that neighborhood, with a community of interests, a unity of ideals. The Warner families and the Clemenses were particularly intimate, and out of their association grew Mark Twain's next important literary undertaking, his collaboration with Charles Dudley Warner in The Gilded Age. A number of more or less absurd stories have been printed about the origin of this book. It was a very simple matter, a perfectly natural development. At the dinner table one night, with the Warners present, criticisms of recent novels were offered, with the usual freedom and severity of dinner table talk. The husbands were inclined to treat rather lightly the novels in which their wives were finding entertainment. The wives naturally retorted that the proper thing for the husbands to do was to furnish the American people with better ones. This was regarded in the nature of a challenge, and as such was accepted, mutually accepted, that is to say, in partnership. On the spur of the moment Clemens and Warner agreed that they would do a novel together, that they would begin it immediately. This is the whole story of the book's origin, so far, at least, as the collaboration is concerned. Clemens, in fact, had the beginning of a story in his mind, but had been unwilling to undertake an extended work of fiction alone. He welcomed only too eagerly, therefore, the proposition of joint authorship. His purpose was to write a tale around that lovable character of his youth, his mother's cousin, James Lampton, to let that gentle visionary stand as the central figure against a proper background. The idea appealed to Warner, and there was no delay in the beginning. Clemens immediately set to work and completed 399 pages of the manuscript, the first 11 chapters of the book, before the early flush of enthusiasm waned. Warner came over then, and Clemens read it aloud to him. Warner had some plans for the story, and took it up at this point, and continued it through the next 12 chapters, and so they worked alternately, in the superstition, as Mark Twain long afterward declared, that we were writing one coherent yarn, when, I suppose, as a matter of fact, we were writing two incoherent ones. The reader may be interested in the division of labor. Clemens wrote chapters 1 to 11, also chapters 24, 25, 27, 28, 30, 32, 33, 34, 36, 37, 42, 43, 45, 51, 52, 53, 57, 59, 60, 61, 62, and portions of chapters 35, 49, 56. Warner wrote chapters 12 to 23, also chapters 26, 29, 31, 38, 39, 40, 41, 44, 46, 47, 48, 50, 54, 55, 58, 63, and portions of chapters 35, 49, and 56. The work was therefore very evenly divided. There was another co-worker on The Gilded Age before the book was finally completed. This was J. Hammond Trumbull, who prepared the variegated, marvelous cryptographic chapter headings. Trumbull was the most learned man that ever lived in Hartford. He was familiar with all the literary and scientific data, and, according to Clemens, could swear in 27 languages. It was thought to be a choice idea to get Trumbull to supply a lingual medley of quotations to precede the chapters in the new book, the purpose being to excite interest and possibly to amuse the reader, a purpose which to some extent appears to have miscarried. The book was begun in February and finished in April, so the work did not lag. The result, if not highly artistic, made astonishingly good reading. Warner had the touch of romance, Clemens the gift of creating, or at least of portraying, human realities. Most of his characters reflected intimate personalities of his early life. Besides the apotheosis of James Lambton into the immortal Sellers, Orion became Washington Hawkins, Squire Clemens the judge, while Mark Twain's own personality, in a greater or lesser degree, is reflected in most of his creations. As for the Tennessee land, so long a will o' the wisp and a bugbear, it became tangible property at last. Only a year or two before, Clemens had written to Orion, "Oh, here, I don't want to be consulted at all about Tennessee. I don't want it even mentioned to me. When I make a suggestion it is for you to act upon it and throw it aside, but I beseech you never to ask my advice, opinion, or consent about that hated property." But it came in good play now. It is the important theme of the story. Mark Twain was well qualified to construct his share of the tale. He knew his characters, their lives, and their atmospheres perfectly. Senator Dilworthy, otherwise Senator Pomeroy of Kansas, then notorious for attempted vote buying, was familiar enough. That winter in Washington had acquainted Clemens with the life there, its political intrigues, and the disrepute of Congress. Warner was equally well qualified for his share of the undertaking, and the chief criticism that one may offer is the one stated by Clemens himself, that the divisions of the tale remain divisions rather than unity. As for the story itself, the romance and the tragedy of it, the character of Laura in the hands of either author is one not easy to forget. Whether this means that the work is well done or only strikingly done, the reader himself must judge. Morally, the character is not justified. Laura was a victim of circumstance from the beginning. There could be no poetic justice in her doom. To drag her out of a steamer wreck, only to make her the victim of a scoundrel, later an adventuress, and finally a murderess, all may be good art, but of a very bad kind. Laura is a sort of American Becky Sharp, but there is retributive justice in Becky's fate, whereas Laura's doom is warranted only by the author's whim. As for her end, whatever the virtuous public of that day might have done, a present-day audience would not have pelted her from the stage, destroyed her future, taken away her life. The authors regarded their work highly when it was finished, but that is nothing. Any author regards his work highly at the moment of its completion. In later years neither of them thought very well of their production, but that also is nothing. The author seldom cares very deeply for his offspring once it is turned over to the public charge. The fact that the story is still popular, still delights thousands of readers, when a myriad of novels that have been written since it was completed have lived their little day and died so utterly that even their names have passed out of memory, is the best verdict as to its worth. End of Chapter 88. The Gilded Age. Read by John Greenman. This is section 89 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, A Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 89, Planning a New Home. Clemens and his wife bought a lot for the new home that winter, a fine, sightly piece of land on Farmington Avenue, tableland, sloping down to a pretty stream that wound through the willows and among the trees. They were as delighted as children with their new purchase and the prospect of building. To her sister, Mrs. Clemens wrote: "Mr. Clemens seems to glory in his sense of possession. He goes daily into the lot, has had several falls trying to lay off the land by sliding around on his feet. For 3 days the ice has covered the trees, and they have been glorious. We could do nothing but watch the beauty outside. If you looked at the trees as the sun struck them, with your back toward the sun, they were covered with jewels. If you looked toward the sun, It was all crystal whiteness, a perfect fairyland. Then the nights were moonlight, and that was a great beauty, the moon giving us the same prismatic effect. This was the storm of which Mark Twain wrote his matchless description, given first in his speech on New England weather, and later preserved in Following the Equator, in more extended form. In that book he likens an ice storm to his impressions derived from reading descriptions of the Taj Mahal, that wonderful tomb of a fair East Indian queen. It is a marvelous bit of word painting, his description of that majestic vision: "When every bough and twig is strung with ice beads, frozen dewdrops, and the whole tree sparkles cold and white, like the Shah of Persia's diamond plume." It will pay any one to look up that description and read it all, though it has been said, by the fortunate one or two who heard him first give it utterance as an impromptu outburst, that in the subsequent process of writing the bloom of its original magnificence was lost. The plans for the new house were drawn forthwith by that gentle architect, Edward Potter, whose art to day may be considered open to criticism, but not because of any lack of originality. Hartford houses of that period were mainly of the goods box form of architecture, perfectly square, typifying the commercial pursuits of many of their owners. Potter agreed to get away from this idea, and a radical and even frenzied departure was the result. Certainly his plans presented beautiful pictures, and all who saw them were filled with wonder and delight. Architecture has lavished itself in many florescent forms since then, but we may imagine that Potter's English violet order of design, as he himself designated it, startled, dazzled, and captivated in a day when most houses were mere habitations, built with a view to economy and the largest possible amount of room. Workmen were put on the ground without delay, to prepare for the builders, and work was rapidly pushed along. Then, in May, the whole matter was left in the hands of the architect and the carpenters, with lawyer Charles E. Perkins to stand between Potter and the violent builder, who roared at Potter and frightened him when he wanted changes; while the Clemens household, with Clara Spaulding, a girlhood friend of Mrs. Clemens, sailed away to England for a half-year holiday. End of Chapter 89. Planning a New Home. Read by John Greenman. This is section 90 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 90. A Long English Holiday. They sailed on the Batavia, and with them went a young man named Thompson, a theological student whom Clemens had consented to take as an amanuensis. There is a pathetic incident connected with this young man, and it may as well be set down here. Clemens found, a few weeks after his arrival in England, that so great was the tax upon his time that he could make no use of Thompson's services. He gave Thompson $50, and upon the possibility of the young man's desiring to return to America, advanced him another $50, saying that he could return it some day, and never thought of it again. But the young man remembered it, and one day, 36 years later, after a life of hardship and struggle, such as the life of a country minister is apt to be, he wrote and enclosed a money order, a payment on his debt. That letter and its enclosure brought only sorrow to Mark Twain. He felt that it laid upon him the accumulated burden of the weary 36 years' struggle with ill fortune. He returned the money, of course, and in a biographical note commented: "How pale painted heroisms of romance look beside it! Thompson's heroism, which is real, which is colossal, which is sublime, and which is costly beyond all estimate, is achieved in profound obscurity, and its hero walks in rags to the end of his days. I had forgotten Thompson completely, but he flashes before me as vividly as lightning. I can see him now. It was on the deck of the Batavia, in the dock. The ship was casting off, with that hubbub and confusion and rushing of sailors, and shouting of orders and shrieking of boatswain whistles, which marked the departure preparations in those days, an impressive contrast with the solemn silence which marks the departure preparations of the giant ships of the present day. Mrs. Clemens, Clara Spaulding, little Susie, and the nursemaid were all properly garbed for the occasion. We all had on our storm rig, heavy clothes of somber hue, but new, and designed and constructed for the purpose, strictly in accordance with sea-going etiquette, anything wearable on land being distinctly and odiously out of the question. Very well. On that deck, and gliding placidly among those honorable and properly upholstered groups, appeared Thompson, young, grave, long, slim, with an aged, fuzzy plug hat towering high on the upper end of him, and followed by a gray duster which flowed down without break or wrinkle to his ankles. He came straight to us and shook hands and compromised us. Everybody could see that we knew him. A nigger in heaven could not have created a profounder astonishment. However, Thompson didn't know that anything was happening. He had no prejudices about clothes. I can still see him as he looked when we passed Sandy Hook and the winds of the big ocean smote us. Erect, lofty, and grand he stood facing the blast, holding his plug on with both hands, and his generous duster blowing out behind, level with his neck. There were scoffers observing, but he didn't know it. He wasn't disturbed. In my mind I see him once afterward, clothed as before, taking me down in shorthand. The Shah of Persia had come to England, and Dr. Hosmer, of the Herald, had sent me to Ostend to view His Majesty's progress across the Channel and write an account of it. I can't recall Thompson after that, and I wish his memory had been as poor as mine. They had been a month in London when the final incident referred to took place, the arrival of the Shah of Persia, and were comfortably quartered at the Langham Hotel. To Twichell, Clemens wrote: We have a luxurious ample suite of apartments on the third floor, our bedroom looking straight up Portland Place, our parlor having a noble array of great windows looking out upon both streets, Portland Place and the crook that joins it onto Regent Street. 9 P.M. Full twilight, rich sunset tints lingering in the west. I am not going to write anything, rather tell it when I get back. I love you and Harmony, and that is all the fresh news I've got anyway, and I mean to keep that fresh all the time. Mrs. Clemens, in a letter to her sister, declared: It is perfectly discouraging to try to write you. There is so much to write about that it makes me feel as if it was no use to begin. It was a period of continuous honor and entertainment. If Mark Twain had been a lion on his first visit, he was little less than royalty now. His rooms at the Langham were like a court. Miss Spaulding, now Mrs. John B. Stanchfield, remembers that Robert Browning, Turgenev, Sir John Millais, Lord Houghton, and Sir Charles Dilke, then at the height of his fame, were among those that called to pay their respects. In a recent letter she says: I remember a delightful luncheon that Charles Kingsley gave for Mr. Clemens, also an evening when Lord Dunraven brought Mr. Home, the medium, Lord Dunraven telling many of the remarkable things he had seen Mr. Home do. I remember I wanted so much to see him float out of a 7 or 8 story window and enter another, which Lord Dunraven said he had seen him do many times, but Mr. Home had been very ill, and said his power had left him. My great regret was that we did not see Carlyle, who was too sad and ill for visits. Among others they met Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, and found him so shy that it was almost impossible to get him to say a word on any subject. The shyest, full grown man, except Uncle Remus, I have ever met, Clemens once wrote. Dr. MacDonald and several other lively talkers were present, and the talk went briskly on for a couple of hours, but Carroll sat still all the while, except now and then when he answered a question. At a dinner given by George Smalley they met Herbert Spencer, and at a luncheon party at Lord Houghton's, Sir Arthur Helps, then a world-wide celebrity. Lord Elcho, a large, vigorous man, sat at some distance down the table. He was talking earnestly about the town of Godalming. It was a deep, flowing, and inarticulate rumble, but I caught the Godalming pretty nearly every time it broke free of the rumbling, and as all the strength was on the first end of the word, it startled me every time, because it sounded so like swearing. In the middle of the luncheon Lady Houghton rose, remarked to the guests on her right and on her left, in a matter-of-fact way, "Excuse me, I have an engagement," and without further ceremony she went off to meet it. This would have been doubtful etiquette in America. Lord Houghton told a number of delightful stories. He told them in French, and I lost nothing of them but the nubs. Little Susy and her father thrived on London life, but after a time it wore on Mrs. Clemens. She delighted in the English cordiality and culture, but the demands were heavy, the social forms sometimes trying. Life in London was interesting, and in its way charming, but she did not enter it with quite her husband's enthusiasm and heartiness. In the end they canceled all London engagements and quietly set out for Scotland. On the way they rested a few days in York, a venerable place such as Mark Twain always loved to describe. In a letter to Mrs. Langdon he wrote: For the present we shall remain in this queer old walled town, with its crooked narrow lanes that tell us of their old day that knew no wheeled vehicles, its plaster and timber dwellings, with upper stories far overhanging the street, and thus marking their date, say 300 years ago, the stately city walls, the castellated gates, the ivy-grown, foliage-sheltered, most noble and picturesque ruin of St. Mary's Abbey, suggesting their date, say 500 years ago, in the heart of crusading times and the glory of English chivalry and romance. The vast cathedral of York, with its worn carvings and quaintly pictured windows, preaching of still remoter days, the outlandish names of streets and courts and byways that stand as a record and a memorial, all these centuries, of Danish dominion here in still earlier times, the hint here and there of King Arthur and his knights and their bloody fights with Saxon oppressors round about this old city more than 1,300 years gone by, and, last of all, the melancholy old stone coffins and sculptured inscriptions, a venerable arch and a hoary tower of stone that still remain and are kissed by the sun and caressed by the shadows every day, just as the sun and the shadows have kissed and caressed them every lagging day since the Roman Emperor's soldiers placed them here in the times when Jesus, the son of Mary, walked the streets of Nazareth a youth, with no more name or fame than the Yorkshire boy who is loitering down this street this moment. They reached Edinburgh at the end of July, and secluded themselves in Veitch's family hotel in George Street, intending to see no one. But this plan was not a success. The social stress of London had been too much for Mrs. Clemens, and she collapsed immediately after their arrival. Clemens was unacquainted in Edinburgh, but remembered that Dr. John Brown, who had written Rab and his Friend, lived there. He learned his address and that he was still a practising physician. He walked around to 23 Rutland Street and made himself known. Dr. Brown came forthwith, and Mrs. Clemens speedily recovered under his able and inspiring treatment. The association did not end there. For nearly a month Dr. Brown was their daily companion, either at the hotel or in his own home, or on protracted drives when he made his round of visits, taking these new friends along. Dr. John was beloved by everybody in Edinburgh, everybody in Scotland for that matter, and his story of Rab had won him a following throughout Christendom. He was an unpretentious sovereign. Clemens once wrote of him, "His was a sweet and winning face, as beautiful a face as I have ever known, reposeful, gentle, benignant, the face of a saint at peace with all the world and placidly beaming upon it the sunshine of love that filled his heart." He was the friend of all dogs and of all people. It has been told of him that once, when driving, he thrust his head suddenly out of the carriage window, then resumed his place with a disappointed look. "Who was it?" asked his companion. "Some one you know?" "No," he said, "a dog I don't know." He became the boon companion and playmate of little Susy, then not quite a year and a half old. He called her Megalopis, a Greek term suggested by her eyes, those deep, burning eyes that seemed always so full of life's sadder philosophies and impending tragedy. In a collection of Dr. Brown's letters he refers to this period. In one place he says: "Had the author of The Innocents Abroad not come to Edinburgh at that time, we in all human probability might never have met. And what a deprivation that would have been to me during the last quarter of a century." And in another place: "I am attending the wife of Mark Twain. His real name is Clemens. She is quite a lovely little woman, modest and clever, and she has a girlie 18 months old. her ludicrous miniature, and such eyes! Those playmates, the good doctor and Megalopis, romped together through the hotel rooms with that complete abandon which few grown persons can assume in their play with children, and not all children can assume in their play with grown ups. They played bear, and the bear, which was a very little one, so little that when it stood up behind the sofa you could just get a glimpse of yellow hair, would lie in wait for her victim and spring out and surprise him and throw him into frenzies of fear. Almost every day they made his professional rounds with him. He always carried a basket of grapes for his patients. His guests brought along books to read while they waited. When he stopped for a call he would say, "Entertain yourselves while I go in and reduce the population." There was much sightseeing to do in Edinburgh, and they could not quite escape social affairs. There were teas and luncheons and dinners with the Dumfarthines and the Abercrombies and the Macdonalds, and with others of those brave clans that no longer slew one another among the grim northern crags and glens, but were as sociable and entertaining lords and ladies as ever the Southland could produce. They were very gentle folk indeed, and Mrs. Clemens in future years found her heart going back oftener to Edinburgh than to any other haven of those first wanderings. August 24th she wrote to her sister: "We leave Edinburgh to morrow with sincere regret. We have had such a delightful stay here. We do so regret leaving Dr. Brown and his sister, thinking that we shall probably never see them again." As indeed they never did. They spent a day or two at Glasgow and sailed for Ireland, where they put in a fortnight, and early in September were back in England again, at Chester, that queer old city where, from a tower on the wall, Charles I read the story of his doom. Reginald Cholmondeley had invited them to visit his country seat, beautiful Condover Hall, near Shrewsbury, and in that lovely retreat they spent some happy, restful days. Then they were in the whirl of London once more, but escaped for a fortnight to Paris, sightseeing and making purchases for the new home. Mrs. Clemens was quite ready to return to America by this time. "I am blue and cross and homesick," she wrote. "I suppose what makes me feel the latter is because we are contemplating to stay in London another month. There has not one sheet of Mr. Clemens's proof come yet, and if he goes home before the book is published here he will lose his copyright, and then his friends feel that it will be better for him to lecture in London before his book is published. Not only that it will give him a larger but a more enviable reputation. I would not hesitate one moment if it were simply for the money that his copyright will bring him, but if his reputation will be better for his staying and lecturing, of course he ought to stay. The truth is, I can't bear the thought of postponing going home." It is rather gratifying to find Olivia Clemens human like that, now and then. Otherwise, on general testimony, one might well be tempted to regard her as altogether of another race and kind. End of Chapter 90. A Long English Holiday. Read by John Greenman. This is section 91 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, A Biography. Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 91. A London Lecture. Clemens concluded to hasten the homeward journey, but to lecture a few nights in London before starting. He would then accompany his little family home, and return at once to continue the lecture series and protect his copyright. This plan was carried out. In a communication to the Standard, October 7th, he said: "Sir, in view of the prevailing frenzy concerning the Sandwich Islands, and the inflamed desire of the public to acquire information concerning them, I have thought it well to tarry yet another week in England and deliver a lecture upon this absorbing subject, and, lest it should be thought unbecoming in me, a stranger, to come to the public rescue at such a time, instead of leaving to abler hands a matter of so much moment, I desire to explain that I do it with the best motives and the most honorable intentions. I do it because I am convinced that no one can allay this unwholesome excitement as effectually as I can, and to allay it, and allay it as quickly as possible, is surely one thing that is absolutely necessary at this juncture. I feel and know that I am equal to this task, for I can allay any kind of an excitement by lecturing upon it. I have saved many communities in this way. I have always been able to paralyze the public interest in any topic that I choose to take hold of and elucidate with all my strength. Hoping that this explanation will show that if I am seeming to intrude, I am at least doing it from a high impulse. I am, sir, your obedient servant, Mark Twain. A day later the following announcement appeared: Queen's Concert Rooms, Hanover Square. Mr. George Dolby begs to announce that Mr. Mark Twain will deliver a lecture of a humorous character, as above, on Monday evening next, October 13th, 1873, and repeat it in the same place on Tuesday evening, October 14th, Wednesday evening, October 15th, Thursday evening, October 16th, Friday evening, October 17th, at 8 o'clock, and Saturday afternoon, October 18th, at 3 o'clock. Subject: Our Fellow Savages of the Sandwich Islands. As Mr. Twain has spent several months in these islands, and is well acquainted with his subject, the lecture may be expected to furnish matter of interest. Stalls, 5 shillings; unreserved seats, 3 shillings. The prospect of a lecture from Mark Twain interested the London public. Those who had not seen him were willing to pay even for that privilege. The papers were encouraging. Punch sounded a characteristic note: "Welcome to a lecturer. 'Tis time we twain did show ourselves,' 'twas said by Caesar, when one Mark had lost his head. By Mark, whose head's quite bright, 'tis said again, therefore go with me, friends, to bless this Twain." Punch. Dolby had managed the Dickens lectures, and he proved his sound business judgment and experience by taking the largest available hall in London for Mark Twain. On the evening of October 13th, in the spacious Queen's Concert Rooms, Hanover Square, Mark Twain delivered his first public address in England. The subject was Our Fellow Savages of the Sandwich Islands, the old lecture with which he had made his first great successes. He was not introduced. He appeared on the platform in evening dress, assuming the character of a manager announcing a disappointment. Mr. Clemens, he said, had fully expected to be present. He paused, and loud murmurs arose from the audience. He lifted his hand, and they subsided. Then he added: "I am happy to say that Mark Twain is present, and will now give his lecture," whereupon the audience roared its approval. It would be hardly an exaggeration to say that his triumph that week was a regal one. For 5 successive nights, and a Saturday matinee, the culture and fashion of London thronged to hear him discourse of their fellow savages. It was a lecture event wholly without precedent. The lectures of Artemus Ward Artemus the Delicious, as Charles Reade called him, came to London in June, 1866, and gave his "piece" in Egyptian Hall. The refined, delicate, intellectual countenance, the sweet, grave mouth, from which one might have expected philosophical lectures, retained their seriousness while listeners were convulsed with laughter. There was something magical about it. Every sentence was a surprise. He played on his audience as Liszt did on a piano, most easily when most effectively. Who can ever forget his attempt to stop his Italian pianist? "Account in his own country, but not much account in this," who went on playing loudly while he was trying to tell us an "affecting incident" that occurred near a small clump of trees shown on his panorama of the Far West. The music stormed on. We could see only lips and arms pathetically moving till the piano suddenly ceased, and we heard it was all we heard "and she fainted in Reginald's arms." His tricks have been attempted in many theaters, but Artemus Ward was inimitable, and all the time the man was dying. Moneur D. Conway, Autobiography. Who had quickly become a favorite in London, had prepared the public for American platform humor, while the daily doings of this new American product, as reported by the press, had aroused interest or curiosity to a high pitch. On no occasion in his own country had he won such a complete triumph. The papers for the week devoted columns of space to appreciation and editorial comment. The Daily News of October 17th published a column and a half editorial on American humor, with Mark Twain's public appearance as the general text. The Times referred to the continued popularity of the lectures. "They can't be said to have more than whetted the public appetite, if we are to take the fact which has been imparted to us, that the holding capacity of the Hanover Square Rooms has been inadequate to the demand made upon it every night by Twain's lecturing as a criterion. The last lecture of this too brief course was delivered yesterday before an audience which crammed to discomfort every part of the principal apartment of the Hanover Square Rooms." At the close of yesterday's lecture Mark Twain was so loudly applauded that he returned to the stage, and as soon as the audience gave him a chance of being heard he said, with much apparent emotion, "Ladies and gentlemen, I won't keep you one single moment in this suffocating atmosphere. I simply wish to say that this is the last lecture I shall have the honor to deliver in London until I return from America 4 weeks from now. I only wish to say" Here Mr. Clemens faltered, as if too much affected to proceed. "I am very grateful. I do not wish to appear pathetic, but it is something magnificent for a stranger to come to the metropolis of the world and be received so handsomely as I have been. I simply thank you." The Saturday Review devoted a page, and Once a Week, under the head of "Cracking Jokes," gave 3 pages, to praise of the literary and lecture methods of the new American humorist. With the promise of speedy return he left London, gave the lecture once in Liverpool, and with his party, October 21st, set sail for home. In mid Atlantic he remembered Dr. Brown and wrote him: "We have plowed a long way over the sea, and there's 2,200 miles of restless water between us now, besides the railway stretch, and yet you are so present with us, so close to us, that a span and a whisper would bridge the distance." So it would seem that of all the many memories of that eventful half year, that of Dr. Brown was the most present, the most tender. End of Chapter 91. A London Lecture. Read by John Greenman. This is section 92 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, A Biography. Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 92. Further London Lecture Triumphs. Orion Clemens records that he met Sam and Livy on their arrival from England November 2nd, and that the president of the Mercantile Library Association sent up his card 4 times in the hope of getting a chance to propose a lecture engagement, an incident which impressed Orion deeply in its evidence of his brother's towering importance. Orion himself was by this time engaged in various projects. He was inventing a flying machine, for one thing, writing a Jules Verne story, reading proof on a New York daily, and contemplating the lecture field. This great blaze of international appreciation which had come to the little boy who used to set type for him in Hannibal and wash up the forms and cry over the dirty proof made him gasp. They went to see Booth in Hamlet, he says, and Booth sent for Sam to come behind the scenes, and when Sam proposed to add a part to Hamlet, the part of a bystander who makes humorous modern comment on the situations in the play, Booth laughed immoderately. Proposing a sacrilege like that to Booth! To what heights had this printer pilot, minor brother, not attained? This idea of introducing a new character in Hamlet was really attempted later by Mark Twain with the connivance of Joe Goodman, of all men, sad to relate. So far as is known, it is the one stain on Goodman's literary record. Clemens returned immediately to England, the following Saturday, in fact, and was back in London lecturing again after barely a month's absence. He gave the "Roughing It" address, this time under the title of "Roughing It on the Silver Frontier," and if his audiences were any less enthusiastic or his houses less crowded than before, the newspapers of that day have left no record of it. It was the height of the season now, and being free to do so, he threw himself into the whirl of it, and for 2 months, beyond doubt, was the most talked of figure in London. The Athenaeum Club made him a visiting member, an honor considered next to knighthood. Punch quoted him. Societies banqueted him. His apartments, as before, were besieged by callers. Afternoons one was likely to find him in Poets' Corner of the Langham smoking room, with a group of London and American authors, Reed, Collins, Miller, and the others, frankly rioting in his bold fancies. Charles Warren Stoddard was in London at the time, and acted as his secretary. Stoddard was a gentle poet, a delightful fellow, and Clemens was very fond of him. His only complaint of Stoddard was that he did not laugh enough at his humorous yarns. Clemens once said, "Dolby and I used to come in after the lecture, or perhaps after being out to some dinner, and we like to sit down and talk it over and tell yarns, and we expected Stoddard to laugh at them. But Stoddard would lie there on the couch and snore. Otherwise, as a secretary, he was perfect." The great Tichborne trial was in progress then, and the spectacle of an illiterate impostor trying to establish his claim as the rightful heir to a great estate was highly diverting to Mark Twain. In a letter of this period he speaks of having attended one of the claimant's evenings. He wanted to preserve the evidence as future literary material, and Stoddard, day after day, patiently collected the news reports and neatly pasted them into scrapbooks, where they still rest, a complete record of that now forgotten farce. The Tichborne trial recalled to Mark Twain the claimant in the Lambton family, who from time to time wrote him long letters urging him to join in the effort to establish his rights to the earldom of Durham. This American claimant was a distant cousin, who had "somehow gotten hold of or had fabricated a full set of documents." Colonel Henry Watterson, just quoted, also a Lambton connection, adds: During the Tichborne trial Mark and I were in London, and one day he said to me, "I have investigated this Durham business down at the Herald's office. There is nothing to it. The Lambtons passed out of the earldom of Durham 100 years ago. There were never any estates. The title lapsed. The present earldom is a new creation, not in the same family at all. But I'll tell you what, if you'll put up $500, I'll put up $500 more. We'll bring our chap over here and set him in as claimant, and my word for it, Kennealy's fat boy won't be a marker to him." It was a characteristic Mark Twain project, one of the sort he never earned out in reality, but loved to follow in fancy, and with the pen sometimes. The "rightful Earl of Durham" continued to send letters for a long time after that. Some of them still exist. But he did not establish his claim. No one but Mark Twain ever really got anything out of it. Like the Tennessee land, it furnished material by and by for a book. Colonel Watterson goes on to say that Clemens was only joking about having looked up the matter in the peerage, that he hadn't really looked it up at all, and that the earldom lies still in the Lambton family. Another of Clemens's friends in London at this time was Prentice Mulford, of California. In later years Mulford acquired a wide reputation for his optimistic and practical psychologies. Through them he lifted himself out of the slough of despond, and he sought to extend a helping hand to others. His White Cross Library had a wide reading and a wide influence, perhaps has to this day. But in 1873 Mulford had not found the tangibility of thought, the secret of strength. He was only finding it, maybe, in his frank acknowledgment of shortcoming. "Now, Mark, I am down, very much down at present. You are up, where you deserve to be. I can't ask this on the score of any past favors, for there have been none. I have not always spoken of you in terms of extravagant praise, have sometimes criticized you, which was due, I suppose, in part to an envious spirit. I am simply human. Some people in the same profession say they entertain no jealousy of those more successful. I can't. They are divine. I am not." It was only that he wished Clemens to speak a word for him to Routledge, to get him a hearing for his work. He adds: "I shall be up myself some day, although my line is far apart from yours. Whether you can do anything that I ask of you or not, I shall be happy then, as I would now, to do you any just and right service. Perhaps I have mistaken my vocation. Certainly if I was back with my rocker on the Tuolumne, I'd make it rattle livelier than ever I did before. I have occasionally thought of London Bridge, but the Thames is now so damn cold and dirty, and besides I can swim, and any attempt at drowning would, through the mere instinct of self-preservation, only result in my swimming ashore and ruining my best clothes. Wherefore I should be worse off than ever." Of course Mark Twain granted the favor Mulford asked, and a great deal more, no doubt, for that was his way. Mulford came up, as he had prophesied, but the sea in due time claimed him, though not in the way he had contemplated. Years after he was one day found drifting off the shores of Long Island in an open boat, dead. Clemens made a number of notable dinner speeches during this second London lecture period. His response to the toast of the "Ladies," delivered at the annual dinner of the Scottish Corporation of London, was the sensational event of the evening. He was obliged to decline an invitation to the Lord Mayor's dinner, whereupon his lordship wrote to urge him to be present at least at the finale, when the welcome would be "none the less hearty," and bespoke his attendance for any future dinners. Clemens lectured steadily at the Hanover Square Rooms during the 2 months of his stay in London, and it was only toward the end of this astonishing engagement that the audience began to show any sign of diminishing. Early in January he wrote to Twichell: "I am not going to the provinces because I cannot get halls that are large enough. I always felt cramped in the Hanover Square Rooms, but I find that everybody here speaks with awe and respect of that prodigious hall, and wonders that I could fill it so long. I am hoping to be back in 20 days, but I have so much to go home to and enjoy with a jubilant joy that it hardly seems possible that it can come to pass in so uncertain a world as this." In the same letter he speaks of attending an exhibition of Landseer's paintings at the Royal Academy. "Ah, they are wonderfully beautiful. There are such rich moonlights and dusks in the challenge and the combat, and in that long flight of birds across a lake, in the subdued flush of sunset or sunrise, for no man can ever tell t'other from which in a picture, except it has the filmy morning mist breathing itself up from the water. And there is such a grave analytical profundity in the face of the connoisseurs, and such pathos in the picture of a fawn suckling its dead mother on a snowy waste, with only the blood in the footprints to hint that she is not asleep, and the way that he makes animals flesh and blood, insomuch that if the room were darkened ever so little, and a motionless living animal placed beside the painted one, no man could tell which was which." I interrupted myself here to drop a line to Shirley Brooks and suggest a cartoon for Punch. It was this: in one of the Academy saloons, in a suite where these pictures are, a fine bust of Landseer stands on a pedestal in the center of the room. I suggested that some of Landseer's best known animals be represented as having come down out of their frames in the moonlight and grouped themselves about the bust in mourning attitudes. He sailed January 13th, 1874, on the Pathia, and 2 weeks later was at home, where all was going well. The Gilded Age had been issued a day or two before Christmas, and was already in its third edition. By the end of January 26,000 copies had been sold, a sale that had increased to 40,000 a month later. The new house was progressing, though it was by no means finished. Mrs. Clemens was in good health. Little Susy was full of such American activities as to earn the name of the Modoc. The promise of the year was bright. End of Chapter 92. Further London lecture triumphs. Read by John Greenman.